Hello, this is Harry Guiremand from the Bloodstained Men, and we are very honored to have with us today Professor Peter Adler, a professor of law from Massachusetts, from Wellesley. And he has written an excellent book, which we want to discuss. It's called Circumcision is a Fraud, The Coming Legal Reckoning. And this is a landmark book. This is not. This is a serious, major event in the history of intactivism and the fight against genital mutilation. So this is a really important moment that we have, and we're very honored to have Peter Adler with us.
Thank you so much, Harry, and for your kind words. I'm really happy to be with you here to talk about the book.
The book was just like a bolt out of the blue. It's just great. I've been, dreaming of a authoritative legal analysis of the problem because, I'm not a lawyer. None of the Bloodstained Men are lawyers. We know there's got to be legal problems here, but until you get a professional, you really don't know. And this book really takes apart the crime of circumcision, the fraud and the open crime of it.
Yes, so the book is based on a published law review article. Robert Van Houw, Travis Wisdom, Felix Das, and I published an article in November 2020 in the Cornell Journal of Law and Medicine called Is Circumcision a Fraud?, where we asked whether it is, and we argued that it is. So it's not just my saying so. It's Dr. Van Houw, who's written more than 100 papers on circumcision, but also the Cornell Journal of Law and Public Policy that carefully proofed the article and was willing to publish it because they believe the claims in it are true.
And so I feel now safe to say it's a fraud. We've been holding up a sign that this circumcision is medical fraud, but hoping we're right. But now I feel like, okay, we're on solid ground. This is established fact.
Thank you for those banners, by the way. It was really gratifying to see them, and you are indeed solid ground holding up those banners.
Yep. It's always awesome for anybody who has a chance to join a Bloodstained Men protest, who understands the issue. It's, it is very gratifying to be out there and let it be known that you're no longer accepting the lies that you've been told. So we have now solid legal backing to back us up. When I read your book, I was wondering, a couple of questions came up. One is, what is the extent of the liability and who is liable? If there's, I think you mentioned 130 million circumcised men alive today in America, something like that. I forgot what the number is, but a lot. And almost all of them would have been circumcised without their consent. So that's a cumulative liability that's got to be just astronomical. Is there a way to assess that?
Yes, I believe so, Harry. So I guess published figures are that there may be 350 million people in the United States. So 175 million men, and maybe 85% of them are circumcised, even though the rate today is perhaps 55%. So you have 80% of 175 million people, males, are circumcised, whether they're boys or men. And so in the book, I argue that physicians and hospitals have committed child abuse against every one of those boys when they were boys, of course, excepting the very rare instance where it's medically necessary to circumcise a boy, but that number is extremely low, like 0.5% or less. So essentially all these circumcised boys and men didn't need to be. And the book argues that it's child abuse and that every one of them had a claim. And so then the question is, do they still have a claim today? Could they bring suit? And the book isn't just theoretical. It talks about, well, can boys and men bring suit? In the course of doing the research, I recalled this so-called discovery rule, that if you've been defrauded, but you don't know it, then your claim, your legal claim doesn't begin to, the statute of limitation doesn't begin to run until you learn of the fraud. It's called the discovery rule. And so in theory, every one of these boys and men has a claim, no matter when they were circumcised, even if it were 50 years ago. So the further that in the past that somebody was circumcised, the less courts are going to be inclined to rule that way. But in theory, they all have claims. They all have fraud claims, because nobody knows it's a fraud. I mean, you've held up the banners and I've written the article, but you know, there are really only a few hundred people who've read the article or the book and know the argument that circumcision is a fraud. So this is kind of breaking news to the world. I think the article in the book, I tried to make it a work of scholarship. It isn't just, it's not mere advocacy. Of course, I'm an opponent of circumcision, but it's really well documented. There are 685 footnotes in the book. And as I said, the book just builds upon the article in the Cornell Journal of Law and Public Policy. And the editors told me, well, we want to make it bulletproof. We're accusing somebody of fraud. Well, we better be right. And of course, they're not responsible for the article, but I'm saying they came to the conclusion that it's a fraud as well. So yeah, in answer to your question, Harry, in my view, all these boys and men have a claim today.
Awesome. So that's got to have somebody shaking in their boots.
Well, I mean, so far, the American medical profession has just become more and more brazen about their claims about circumcision. The book argues that the claims have never been valid and it will never be possible to justify unnecessary, non-consensual genital cutting, whether it's male or female. But the proponents of circumcision have been making claims about it for the last 150 years. And the claims in the past were often ridiculous, such as that it prevents or cures many and even all diseases, which is the classic claim of quack selling snake oil. And in 1971, the American Academy of Pediatrics said there's no medical indication for it, period. That was the extent of their guidelines in 1971. Not medically indicated means there's no need for it and it's not desirable. So they know that. And once they used to circumcise boys without even asking the parents, which is clearly unlawful. You must have permission for every operation, even if it's needed or it's a battery. So all of those circumcisions were a battery. But then what happened is they probably got sued, the American Academy of Pediatrics or some doctors and hospitals. So then they said, all right, well, now circumcision is elective. You know, it's not routine anymore. We don't just do it routinely, like whenever a child's born, even right after they were born, sometimes immediately right in the delivery room, the first thing. So they need permission. And then once they needed permission and they said it was elective or a choice, a lot of parents decided against it. And what happened is the circumcision rates declined. Well, this is a multi-billion-dollar per year industry. So according to the American Academy of Pediatrics, each circumcision can cost upwards of $1,750 when hospital fees are included, nurses, assistants, and anesthesia if it's used. And so I think Intact America, I believe, is estimated 1.5 million boys are circumcised per year. So it's up to $1,750 each. So can't do the math in my head, but I think it comes to billions of dollars per year. But that's just this year. What about last year, the year before, the year before? There used to be 200 million. So 2 million boys per year were circumcised. So not only is it a multi-billion-dollar industry to circumcise boys, but a lot of them need revision surgery or repair surgery to fix the errors that were caused by the first. So that's another big business. I wish I had the numbers at hand, but it's some significant percentage of the number of boys circumcised need to be circumcised again. But then, so you have to add that to the about $2.5 billion base. So that's probably takes you to $3 billion a year industry now. But then some hospitals, we don't know how many, sell the foreskins to the pharmaceutical and cosmetics industry. So in the book, I say, well, look, I don't know how many foreskins are being sold, but we know it's happening. And I know I've seen foreskins for sale online. I went online once and I was able to, could have put it in my shopping cart. You could order it up if you're, a pharmaceutical company, you order it online. Illegally harvested, criminally taken, from boys, and they sell them and make them into material for skin grafts and other valuable enterprises. But in the book, what I say is the pharmaceutical industry, this is a multi-billion-dollar industry. They don't produce drugs unless it's going to produce billions of dollars in revenue. I think it can cost up to $1 billion to get approval of a new drug. It's not a drug, but what I'm saying is the pharmaceutical companies, they don't do anything that isn't worth $1 billion. So my guess is the industry could $5 billion or more per year.
I see. And is this that's it's a staggering amount, and that doesn't even cover the pain of the violation of rights or the torture or the
pain and suffering. Yeah, exactly. So that's exactly right. So the question is, what would be if a man, or let's say, forgetting about the statute of limitations, let's say a boy reaches the age of majority, brings suit, and he wins. What's the value of what should he recover? Well, you have the extreme pain and suffering, extreme for a short period of time, but then you have the suffering that continues for, maybe 4 to 6 weeks thereafter. And then you have psychological harm that's caused to people. But then what I argue in the book is that these boys and men are also entitled to all the profits that all of these industries get from the foreskin, because they weren't allowed to take it in the first place. And so if they win, they should get a percentage of the hospital's profits, the doctor's profits, and the profits on the sale of the foreskins, whatever that may be. But even just looking at, well, I've left out the most important, the loss of the most sensitive part of the penis for life that also facilitates comfortable sexual intercourse. So what is that worth? Well, I would argue it's priceless. You can't put a price on it. People wouldn't go and give up part of their penis. Men don't volunteer to be circumcised. So this notion, the American Academy of Pediatrics, or sometimes they talk about, well, men, can decide for themselves when they reach the age of majority. Men who have a foreskin, they don't sit around thinking, oh, gee, maybe I'll go into the hospital and have it cut off. That's just part of the preposterous claims that the medical industry makes. Like it's cleaner and it avoids embarrassment in the locker room. Who cares about that? Men who have a foreskin, they don't give it up for anything. So in court, the good lawyer would argue that this is worth a whole lot of money. And now in the past, so Attorneys for the Rights of the Child has a page where they talk about judgments. So botched circumcision, that's where the most money is. And I believe there was one judgment for $32 million. And so I'm guessing that because circumcision is a deeply embedded cultural norm in the US, judges and juries may not really realize, what the loss is, and may not put a very big price on it. But I think that's going to change. once people realize it's the most sensitive part of the penis, once people say how angry they are and they have psychological problems and they realize how bad the pain and suffering was, and the lifelong, impact on sexuality, I mean, I would think we're talking millions of dollars in every case, in my view.
So we're in now the millions times millions. So it's millions times 100 million. So it's like a trillion or 100.
I don't trillions,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
you're right. But the multiplier effect of, costing $1,750 each, you have the pain and the suffering, and then you have the loss of foreskin and the profits, and you get times, 150 million people, you're getting up to, well, it probably is trillions of dollars, actually. I haven't done the math, but it's an awful lot of money.
And is it fair to say that liability already exists today? That because the crime has already been committed and the damage has already been done, that the liability already exists?
Yes. That's, legal scholars have been arguing this since 1985 without serious opposition. So in 1985, William Brigman wrote an article, Circumcision as Child Abuse. And, he said children have been exploited throughout history. And one of the ways they've been exploited is genital cutting. I don't know if he mentioned female genital cutting, but it has to be treated the same way as male genital cutting from the legal perspective. And he said it's child abuse. Child abuse is defined in such a way as, impairing an organ. And if you seriously impair an organ, it's serious child abuse. So what I'm saying is the non-therapeutic elective circumcision violates the child abuse statutes plainly, and nobody's really argued otherwise. So I was at a debate where Stephen Svoboda argued that circumcision violates the rights to child, and he was debating Dr. Michael Brady from the American Academy of Pediatrics, but Douglas Dekema was there also, the ethicist on the American Academy of Pediatrics. And so on day one, Svoboda made a very compelling arguments that circumcision is already illegal, it's child abuse, and it's a battery. And so then it was a chance for Dr. Brady to talk. And the title of the debate was, is circumcision ethical and legal? And Dr. Brady had one slide, and all it said is, no doctor has ever been held liable for a properly performed circumcision. Well, that's ridiculous. That's like saying slavery, we had 100 years of slavery and nobody stopped it. Well, it was never lawful, to enslave a person, even before the constitutional amendment made it illegal. And yes, circumcision is illegal as all get out already. Now, Harry, granted, no court in the US has ever ruled that, but courts in Europe, numerous courts, I think about 10 by my count, they're in the book. I would count the number in the book. But, courts in Germany, Austria, and 2 in England have ruled that there is no religious right to circumcise a boy, a right to circumcise a boy for religious reasons. So then there would be no right to circumcise a boy for cultural reasons, or so that the penis will look like daddy, or for any reason other than a valid medical reason. Well, the only valid medical reason would be that you need the operation and there's no alternative. But boys hardly ever do need the operation. There usually are alternatives. So for example, urinary tract infections, that's a completely bogus argument that it reduces the risk of urinary tract infections or prevents them. Well, it doesn't prevent them. And the claim is it reduces them by 1%. The claim is unproven. But even if it were true, urinary tract infections can be treated with antibiotics. That's the proper approach. No child able to reason would ever say, go ahead and cut part of my penis in the 1 in 100 chance that it will prevent a urinary tract infection, because urinary tract infections aren't a problem. They can be treated. And another point, Harry, is that the implications, people may not realize this means 100 people will be harmed. 100 boys and men will be harmed by circumcision. They're going to have pain and they're going to have the loss of foreskin for life in the off chance that it might prevent a urinary tract infection in only one of them. So 99 out of the 100 won't have any benefit at all. And that violates fundamental rules of medicine. I mean, doctors can't go around cutting off healthy body parts in the off chance it might, prevent some disease. That's just a wacky.
I wonder if there's a model of other cases where there have been improper or forced amputations and settlements, what the settlements were for. I mean, it's somebody improperly cuts off a leg or a foot or a finger or whatever without proper medical justification. I mean, surely there must have been cases like that, and there must have been settlements that would provide at least a rule of thumb for what an unnecessary amputation, what the liability is for that.
Yeah, so I don't know the question of what liabilities juries have found, but I did find cases that say, as you would expect, that it's unlawful to perform unnecessary surgery on a healthy person. The exception would be cosmetic surgery with adult consent. But in Tortorella v. Castro, the appeals court of California said it seems self-evident that it is injurious to perform unnecessary surgery. I mean, it causes pain, it risks complications, and you have a loss of the body part. And then in another case, Lloyd versus Kramer, the court said unnecessary surgery on a healthy person gives rise to claims for battery, which is an unlawful touching, and for a breach of fiduciary duty. So breach of fiduciary duty is a breach of trust. So this is a really important concept in medicine. In a lot of the world, like in business, business is known to be rough and tough. And you can compete, strongly or in a tough manner, as long as it isn't unfair and deceptive. And if you're a business and you're hurt, you have to prove you were hurt and that you were wrong. But in medicine, it's different. The physician has a fiduciary duty to act in the best interest of his or her patient. And it's based on trust because the public doesn't know anything about medicine. And boys they're below the age of consent, and infants can't even think or reason. So medicine is completely based on trust. And so these doctors are held to the highest standard in the law. The fiduciary duty to a patient is the highest duty in the law. And so what I'm leading up to is, if a doctor breaches the trust that a patient places in the physician, then the patient can sue for breach of fiduciary duty. And the burden falls to the doctor to prove that he or she had a valid reason for having removed a body part, performed surgery. And what I argue in the book, it'll never be possible to justify removing the foreskin any more than it would be to perform genital cutting on a girl or to remove a finger, exactly your case, unless it needed to be removed and there was no alternative. And I think you've touched on something important, that what I argue in the book is that doctors try to make this look complex, that, they talk about the pros and cons. They want you to start weighing the pros and cons, which lay people do. They don't know anything about medicine. And what the book says, it's all pretty simple. You can't cut off a healthy part of a child's body, period. It doesn't matter what the body part was, and it doesn't matter what arguments you make in favor of it, you'll never be able to justify. It's completely indefensible. So you know that all the arguments that have been made in the past are malarkey, and you know that all the ones they make today are malarkey, and all the ones they could ever make in the future are malarkey, or Brian Earp calls them BS, would be more accurate.
Right. So it is stunning that we are still, that all of this is still going on, and it shows that the medical profession will never get their own house in order. without lawsuits, they'll never, there's no indication, no sense that they have any shame, any responsibility, any decency, nothing. I mean, it's just like you expect. So, I mean, my expectations for doctors are so different from this reality that they have absolutely, it's just unbelievable. I mean, well, it's believable because it's a reality, but they will never fix it on their own. It's only lawsuits that will change it.
Yeah, Harry, I mean, I agree with you. Doctors have made more than 100 false claims about circumcision preventing or curing disease in the last 150 years. In other words, they've claimed that it prevents or cures more than 100 diseases, in addition to making ridiculous arguments such as it's cleaner, it's better, it avoids embarrassment in the locker room, and other plainly specious reasons. So you have 150 years of false medical claims and of frivolous claims, and the false legal claim that parents have the right to elect it and doctors have the right to take orders from parents to cut off a healthy part of a child's body. It's just a complete non-starter. And so it looks to me as if the tide is turning against circumcision, although the American Academy of Pediatrics tried to reverse that in 2012. And the numbers show that they were able to revive Medicaid coverage in 3 states, and they've been able to increase the number of circumcisions by making brazen false claims. So, in the book, I say, well, what can be done other than suing doctors, that might help? And one thing that's extremely valuable is what you and the Bloodstained Men and women do, taking to the streets. It really can't be underestimated how important that is. Because, public doesn't read legal articles. They're not looking for the latest publication in the Cornell Journal of Law and Public Policy. They wouldn't want to read it anyway, but they see people on the street. But what I say in the book, after saying, well, we could have better consent forms, and we could lobby legislators, and we could do this and we could do that. And I say, but look, let's be realistic. They're just not going to stop. And as I said a little earlier, doctors have become even more brazen. They just make crazy claims like prevents HIV. The 2012 American Academy of Pediatrics circumcision guidelines literally say that circumcision prevents HIV, penile cancer, and urinary tract infections. When they know that's false, they know the actual claim is it reduces the risk of penile cancer by like 1 in 400,000, or a crazy number.
And that's highly contested too. I mean, that claim is contested, even though it's small. It's also in doubt.
Yeah. So one of the things I say in the book is because physicians have this fiduciary duty, they have to be honest. They can't go around making false claims that they can't prove. They have the burden of proving these claims. They need to prove that it prevents HIV. If they're going to claim that, they'll never be able to do that because it doesn't. We have more HIV in the US than in Europe, where boys aren't circumcised. And I believe it's contested whether it reduces the risk of penile cancer as well. And so these claims that it reduces the risk of these diseases, they're pretextual rationalizations that have been used effectively to sell circumcision after it was known that it doesn't do anybody any good. But it sounds like a reason, but it really isn't.
It's the latest, most scary bugaboo, and that's what they always have used.
Well, that's exactly.
So the 2012 AAP statement expired in 2017 because after 5 years it has to be renewed or it expires. So it's expired, but the CDC picked it up and has a ruling that says that they have guidelines for physicians should counsel parents to circumcise their boy to prevent HIV. And that's in force, correct? Is that correct?
Yes, so you're right. The AAP guidelines in 2012 expired 5 years later, automatically in 2017. One point I would make about that, though, is even though they've expired, they haven't withdrawn them or renounced them, right? So all these claims that were widely publicized that people bought into and that increased the circumcision rate, those claims are still out there. It's as if they're making them to this day. It doesn't matter that they've expired. They're still out there and influential. So if the AAP was doing its job, it would renounce them. But as you say, the CDC picked it up. So you might think, okay, these are two powerful organizations. They must know what they're talking about. There must be something to it. And the fact is that the people who wrote those guidelines, they're the same people. So Robert Van Hout tells me that the people who wrote the AAP guidelines are the who's who of circumcision advocates. And some of them have a religious bias in favor of circumcision. They're religious adherents and they're desperate to preserve it as a religious right. So it's a huge conflict of interest. So the fact that the CDC said the same thing, it isn't more persuasive. It's really more evidence of how it's a tiny little cabal, if I'm using the right word, of people who have enormous financial as well as, in some cases, religious incentives to perpetuate circumcision.
And when there's a religious conflict of interest, is that required to be disclosed? I've never seen that before, where I'm a Jew, therefore I cannot, I have a conflict of interest in this discussion.
Absolutely. And I think I can prove that the American Academy of Pediatrics knows this, because when it came out with its guidelines, it said, does anybody have comments on these guidelines? And I was one of the people who made comments. And it says, do you have any conflict of interest? In medicine, you have to disclose any conflict of interest. So you might think, well, religion and medicine, they're supposed to be different. So do you have to disclose if you have a bias in favor of religious reasons? The answer is absolutely yes. If you have any bias that might prevent you from doing your job as a doctor, you must disclose it, yes. And so that they haven't disclosed financial bias or the religious bias or their cultural bias.
So that's also disqualifying.
Another fraud, really. I mean, not to disclose your biases. Like how would anybody know that the members of the AAP, quite a few of them are Jewish, and many Jews believe that it's a sacred religious right to circumcise your son. And one of the members of the AAP, his name, published an article essentially saying, well, nobody really has their son circumcised for medical reasons anyway. They do it for religious and cultural and personal reasons. And he circumcised his own son, he said, because he had thousands of years of ancestors looking over his shoulder. And then he argued that why should all penises have to look the same? And reading that, I was just astonished. So basically, they're admitting what they knew in 1971, that it's not, there's no medical indication to circumcise a boy. There's no valid medical reason. People don't really circumcise their children for medical reasons. They circumcise boys for religious, cultural, and mostly so that for personal reasons, meaning so that the penis will look like daddy. There's absolutely no way doctors are allowed to take orders from parents to cut off a body part for reasons having nothing to do with medicine. It's just a non-starter. So
medicine has
says you about that doctors do this. It's astonishing, but there's I consider it an evil. There's a lot of evil in the world, but you wouldn't think it would be perpetrated on infants and
right. So medicine has to be based on science, not religion. I mean, religion is not science. There's no truck there. There's no exception, is there? I mean,
no, there isn't. The medical students, they go to medical school and they study science and medicine and they learn how to diagnose illness. They are told, they take the Hippocratic Oath whereby they promise not to harm anybody. First, do no harm. You don't take a healthy person and harm them, which is what non-therapeutic forced non-consensual circumcision does. And when they do have a patient with a medical condition, they have to diagnose the medical condition. They have to consider alternatives, weigh alternatives, and then they have to discuss the alternatives with the patient. So if they were doing their jobs, they would say, well, we don't have any diagnosis here. They're perfectly healthy. So they're not allowed to go to the next phase of, do we cut it off? you only get to that if it needs to be treated. Then if let's say you have a penile condition that needs to be treated, then the question is, what's the most conservative treatment that can be done? So let's say you cut your foot. Well, you put a Band-Aid on it. You don't cut it off. I mean, you could treat it by cutting it off, but you'd lose the leg. So you put a Band-Aid on it. This is all sort of basic. It took me a long time to realize it's all sort of basic. That
Yeah.
we all intuitively know that it's not a good idea to cut off part of a boy's penis.
And the doctor's responsibility is to the child, not to the parents. What the parents want is not has no bearing. Is that
exactly right, Harry? And the American Academy of Pediatrics itself said that. There's an article written by the Committee on Children, Ethics in Children, and it said that the proxy consent poses serious issues. In other words, that's when a parent consents on behalf of a child. And it went on to say the duty of a physician is to provide competent medical care, meaning the care that the patient needs, regardless and irrespective of the desires of the parents. So of course the parents may have desires that are different from what's best for the health of the child, but the doctor is not allowed to take them into consideration. So the notion that a person who believes that circumcision is required by their God can go to a doctor and say, I believe my God commanded it, so please cut off part of my son's penis. There's absolutely no way a doctor is allowed to take that into consideration.
Yeah. So another lie that the AAP's task force has presented. You mentioned also big tobacco and the way they've defrauded people and how they were held to account for defrauding. I think I don't know if you mentioned it, but when I was reading about it, U.S. versus Philip Morris, 2006, Philip Morris was charged under the Racketeering, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act, or the RICO Act. So you never mentioned racketeering as a possible charge against the AAP. And I'm wondering if Big Tobacco was charged as racketeers because they lied to people about the addictive quality of tobacco and the health problems of tobacco. Would AAP also be subject to a RICO Act charge?
Well, that's a really interesting question, Harry. You're ahead of me. I never thought about it. So I am not that knowledgeable about class actions, but if a class action lawsuit could be brought, as was brought against cigarette companies, that would be the best way to proceed, because then it would represent a whole class of injured people, and the injured people wouldn't have to pay for the representation. So RICO, I only know a little bit about it, but I think it comes into effect when there's a fraud, maybe against the government, I'm not sure, where there's more than one fraud, sort of repeated instances, but I think it only has to be two. And so that I believe
it includes terrorizing, and certainly mutilating a boy without anesthetic is terrorizing him, and confinement or false imprisonment. So you raised that. So, I mean, whether that's an open avenue of pursuit against AAP is a question just to consider. I don't know.
So you probably know there is a lawsuit right now against the American Academy of Pediatrics, and it's the lawsuit alleges they defrauded the public and parents and boys in its 1989 and 1999 guidelines. So it's the same claim that could be brought today about the 2012 guidelines, and lawyers are standing by ready to bring that suit. So this is like a starter suit, if you will, and it's pending in New Jersey. So there are lawsuits that are coming to USA. I think doctors probably haven't been so scared because nobody's held them liable to date. But the European cases somewhere close to 10 of them find it's unlawful and a crime, criminal assault. And the best thing that doctors could do is put down a knife right now. At least they'll, they won't be liable for anything in future. Otherwise, every time they perform a circumcision, they can be held liable. And also, there's a possibility of punitive damages, not to be underestimated. Whenever a defendant engages in conduct and reckless indifference to safety and health, they can be held liable for punitive damages. It can be unlimited in amount. And I think that it would be appropriate to award very large punitive damages against the American Academy of Pediatrics.
Yes, absolutely. Also, the sale of the foreskin, would that fall as organ theft? Would that be covered under organ theft or some human trafficking issues, or is there any avenue there?
Yeah, I think so. So I looked up the law when I was finishing the book, and so I was trying to think, well, if I can explain this, if an activity is criminal, you can't make a contract about it. You can't have a contract to kill somebody. Obviously, if you had that contract, it would be void. So because it's criminal assault and child abuse to a circumcised boy, in my view, all the contracts related to it, like the consent form and so on, they're all void. And the contract to sell the foreskin to the pharmaceutical industry, those are void. So then the question is, could the pharmaceutical industry be held liable? And what I found is that it's a crime under federal law and a crime under state law in Massachusetts, and presumably in every state in the nation, to knowingly purchase or use or resell stolen property. And so I think these unlawfully harvested foreskins are stolen property. And so all that's needed is that the pharmaceutical companies know that that's stolen property. So what I think should happen is that people should write to all these pharmaceutical companies certified letters and put them on notice that they're using stolen property. And then they could be criminally prosecuted under federal and state law.
Awesome.
And the only issue is, because people listen to the doctors and trust them and believe them, and because it's a deeply embedded cultural norm, the state and federal governments are not prosecuting this yet. I mean, you can go to your, local police and report child abuse, and I know somebody who tried it, and you don't get anywhere. They don't know it's child abuse, and so in the book, I argue it's the perfect crime. The perfect crime is one where you don't know who did it to you, and you don't know it's a crime, like unless somebody explains it. It's the perfect crime. It's also the perfect fraud. People don't know they've been defrauded. So, but I think that public opinion is turning against circumcision pretty fast. And George Ann Chapin of Intact America said the way these movements work is that at first they make their arguments like gay people should have rights and nobody believes them, and then slowly people start to accept it, and apparently it happens fairly rapidly, where you don't need to get to 50% or something for the public. I'm not sure I'm expressing this well, but once about a third of the people see that this is unlawful, unfair, whatever, then public opinion rapidly turns against it. So I'm thinking over the next few years, and the younger people as well, they don't buy this stuff. When I talk to young people, that you don't have to really argue with them. I say I'm opposed to circumcision. They're like, well, of course. Who is?
Right.
We just need the older people to die off, I guess.
Yeah, that's the science advances one funeral at a time, as the old saying goes.
Not really in favor of older people dying, but realistically, when this generation of doctors is gone and legislators and young people and more women come into power, then the tide will turn against us even more. but I think it's turning pretty.
Right. And the other thing is that I wondered is when the CDC and the AAP had their guidelines, is part of the motivation in that cover against lawsuits so that they know they have this liability and they know that the dam could burst at any time and they could be bankrupt because they can't possibly come up with $1 trillion to pay out the claims if they were to all show up. As part of the motivation just to cover their asses so that they can dodge the liability?
Yeah, you're asking great questions, all of them, especially since you're not a lawyer. But in the lawsuit that was brought based on the 1989 and 1999 guidelines, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the claim is made that the AAP was afraid of lawsuits. There had been a lawsuit and it was settled successfully, and they were afraid that they were going to be sued. Doctors would be sued for circumcisions. So they came up with the idea that circumcision reduces the risk of urinary tract infections in 1989. And that when they did, they knew their studies were flawed. And as a legal scholar, Matthew Giannetti, who said that the AAP could be held liable for negligent misrepresentations and possibly intentionally fraudulent misrepresentations. In other words, exactly as you said, they came up with UTIs as a pretext to defend the industry against claims that you couldn't do this. And so, yes, history repeated itself, has repeated itself. There were declining circumcision rates. The AAP was very worried about physicians being sued. They're a trade association, they represent physicians. They came up with HIV, our disease of the day, as a reason to circumcise, and probably quite effectively, because people are afraid of HIV. And it turns out, well, it doesn't prevent HIV. And the claim was it reduces it by 60%. That's misleading because it's 60% is relative terms. The claim really is it reduces it by 1.3% in Africa. And those studies were flawed. So once again, they're using flawed studies. It's just another pretext. But
right.
It's terrible advice. Like, you might want to have your son circumcised to reduce the risk of HIV. What you really want to be telling people is whether you're circumcised or not, you're at risk of getting HIV. You cannot count on circumcision to do anything for you. The chance of it helping any boy or man are close to zero. If you want to avoid HIV, you need to practice safe sex or avoid unsafe sex, in which case it won't be of any advantage to have been circumcised. So there is no medical benefit whatsoever to being circumcised. There's no medical reason why you would choose.
Yeah. I once had a professional, a real estate professional, in a first world country tell me he couldn't get HIV because he was circumcised. I mean, he was convinced. He was like, well, no, I can't get HIV because I'm circumcised. It's
called risk compensation, as the official term, I guess, academic term. And what it means is, people, they assume a risk because they think they're not. So the claim by the AAP that it reduces the risk of HIV or prevent it is going to cause more HIV.
Exactly. But they don't care. They just don't care. They don't care what harm they do to babies, to men, to society. They just don't care. That's what really gets me, is that they just don't care. It's like how immoral, how irresponsible. These are supposed to be the most trusted members of society, and they're utterly irresponsible people.
I completely agree with you. I just want to give an example of that. When we were at the debate with Steven Svoboda versus Michael Brady and Alice Deacom, the ethicist, so Svoboda said, well, this violates the rights of the child to bodily integrity and self-determination or autonomy. Autonomy is a fundamental concept in medicine. You always need to obtain the patient's consent whenever possible. And if they're a child, that doesn't mean you go ask their parents. It means you wait until they're able to consent on their own. So you're required to leave them alone. So Svoboda, who's brilliant, made this absolutely compelling case. And so the next day, as I said, Dr. Brady, all he said is nobody's ever been held liable for a properly performed circumcision. So I spoke and I said, well, who cares? Nobody's ever been held liable. It hasn't been prosecuted. There are lots of crimes that aren't, prosecuted. And then I said to them, well, Attorney Svoboda made a very compelling case that this violates the rights of the child. What do you have to say for yourselves? And then Dr. Guiremand, to the best of my knowledge, said, well, the American Academy of Pediatrics does not adhere to the notion that children have these rights. And I was thinking to myself, these rights date back to the 1600s. These are inalienable rights. The right to personal security or bodily integrity and the right to autonomy or freedom are absolutely fundamental, inalienable, the most basic fundamental rights that anybody has. And the US adopted all of English common law, shortly after the country was formed. And you can't just ignore the fact that children have rights. So they make these claims that children have no rights. Well, where are you going to find that in the law? You don't have to go look it up to know that they're wrong. They never back it up with anything. It's all malarkey. I don't like to swear, but Brian Earp says he wrote an article that appears very much to be about circumcision. And he said, what if you have somebody like Voldemort who doesn't care about the rules and doesn't play fair and is willing to make any claims and just keep making them one after another so fast that people can't even respond to them. And it's certainly my view that that's what the American the American Academy of Pediatrics has done. And by the way, it's the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists has endorsed the AAP, so they're making the same claims, whether they made them or not. They say, we agree with all this. I mean, how they can do that, I really don't know. I did want to say there could be individual physicians, who they might think that they have a medical basis for this, some of them. But I think once you've performed one circumcision, you would know. Like if you're a medical student and an attending physician tells you to assist, you've never seen one before, you don't know what it is, and you think it's medicine, and so you do it. But I think after you've seen one, you're causing incredible pain to the baby. Any lay person would start thinking, should I be doing this? Well, if lay people were thinking that, well, the doctors should be thinking that. So I do think a lot of them are, I view them as evil. I don't see how anybody could do this to any boy of any age, and especially a newborn. Make one more point, Harry, also that it might cause neurological damage. Experiments in rats show if you expose them to extreme pain in infancy, in the neonatal period, it can cause neurological damage. It can damage their brains, and it can also cause psychological harm. It's traumatic, as Ronald Goldman, the psychologist, writes. How anybody can do this to a baby in the 21st century, and how the government can let it get away with it, because states use Medicaid to pay for it, and that's unlawful too. The doctors defraud the Medicaid program because they certify that it's medically necessary. They need to do that to get paid. So every time they perform a circumcision on a healthy child, they use a false diagnosis and they falsely certify that it's medically necessary. And the government lets them get away with it.
And when Massachusetts challenged the Medicaid funding, how did that turn out? I didn't hear the end of that.
Yeah, I'm lead counsel, and I'm really pleased to report that so far we're winning the case.
Awesome.
Taxpayers brought suit under a statute that gives the right of taxpayers to sue whenever money's being spent unlawfully by the state in violation of some clear law. And so we say, well, the doctors are committing Medicaid fraud and the state is supposed to stop it. The state is supposed to require proof of medical necessity, and the state is required to set up an institutional review board to review those payments and it hasn't done so. So the state, instead of saying, yes, you're right, came up with all sorts of bogus arguments, like we rely on the doctors. The doctors, they must be using their discretion. They must be, know what's best. And we're saying, no, you're supposed to be an independent watchdog. You're not, you haven't set up a review board. And so the judge ruled in our favor that the taxpayers have the right to proceed on their claims, that the state is violating state law. And so the judge wrote a lengthy opinion, and he said, this is an important case, and it's important to get it right. And therefore, he referred it himself. It's called an interlocutory appeal, very unusual. And he sent it to the appeals court, and it's with the appeals court. And so we submitted an appellate brief. The state replied. We said their arguments were no good. They have nothing. They're going to respond by the 15th, and then we have oral argument next month. But the bottom line is, so far we're winning. I'd be very surprised if the appeals court of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts said that this statute, which is very clear in its wording, that if they ruled that it doesn't apply. It seems to me this case is a layup, but we'll have to see.
Awesome. Well, it's really good work. I mean, that's a major win. If we can put that one in the bag, that's a major win. And yeah, good work.
Just want to make a shout out to co-counsel from Jersey, Andrew Delaney. He's a young man, and he has 3 circumcision lawsuits. He's one of the lead counsel in suing the American Academy of Pediatrics, and so it's good to see a zealous, young, capable attorneys in the field.
Yes. Yeah, they'll take up the baton at some point, and yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah. Well, I've taken an hour of your time. It's probably more than I should, so I'm going to start wrapping it up. Is there anything else you'd like to say, Peter?
I think your questions are so probing and allowed me to say anything that I would have offered to say. I can't think of anything else. I guess if you're an opponent of circumcision, I would appreciate it if you would buy the book. It's
Yes.
Circumcision is a Fraud and the Legal Reckoning. It's available on Amazon, and it's only costs $2.99 to get the digital copy. And if you like what you read and could leave a comment, that would all help the movement. And certainly encourage people to take to the streets and join the Bloodstained Men. I always think of calling it the Bloodstained Men and Women because there are women in it too.
Yeah.
Which I'm very pleased about.
Yeah, Bloodstained Men and Their Friends is our actual name, but yeah.
Very good.
Every intactivist, everybody seeing this video should have a copy of this on your bookshelf. This is essential reading, absolutely essential reading for every intactivist. If you don't get the hard copy, get the Kindle copy, the Kindle that has links that are live links. You can go right to all the references by clicking on the links. If you have the hard copy, get the Kindle copy too, because the links are very helpful and makes it a lot easier to, there's as Peter said, there's 600 or so references. It's a comprehensive volume. It's a serious work of scholarship, and every intactivist should have a copy of it. This is a breakthrough for the intactivist movement, and we have Peter Adler to thank for this wonderful effort. So thank you so much, Peter. It's been just a joy to talk to you, and I hope we can chat again in the future.
Thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure.
Okay. Bye now.